The woman from the placing society set her pen down on the parlor table, folded her hands, and told Wyatt Lofton to choose one. There were 8 of them lined up along the wall of the mission house in Meridian Flat, Oklahoma Territory, on a gray morning in March of 1894. 8 children in borrowed coats, scrubbed pink at the ears, standing in the order the matron had put them in, and Wyatt Lofton, 38 years old, a trail hand who had never in his life owned a roof, looked at all 8 of them and understood that whatever he said in the next 10 seconds would follow him the rest of his days. He did not choose one. But before you hear what he did say, you have to know what happened to him in Missouri when he was 9 years old, because that is the whole reason he could not do the arithmetic they were asking him to do. The society was called the Western Benevolent Placing Association, and its agent for the territory was Mrs. Harriet Voss, 58, a widow out of Cincinnati who had been moving children west on trains since the year after the war. She had a black bonnet, a ledger with a marbled cover, and a reputation for being fair, which is not the same thing as being soft. The 8 children had come off the westbound car 3 days before. They were not 8 strangers. They were the children of one household, a homestead family up on the Cimarron, whose mother and father had both passed quietly, 4 days apart, in the fever that came through in February. The neighbors had done what neighbors could for a month. Then the county wrote to the society, and the society sent Mrs. Voss. Wilkie was 14 and carried himself like a man who had been told to. Tacy was 12 and did the talking for the little ones. Hosea was 11 and had not said a word since the train. Neva was 9. Ossie was 8 and had a cowlick that no water would lie down. Cleta was 6. Loyal was 4 and held on to Tacy's skirt with both fists, and Meta was 2, asleep against Wilkie's shoulder with her cheek stamped red from the wool of his coat. 4 families in Meridian Flat had come to the parlor that morning. 3 of them left with a child apiece by noon. Wyatt Lofton came last, hat in his hands, because he had ridden in off the winter camp at the Bar M, and had not known there was anything to come for until the storekeeper told him. "Mr. Lofton," Mrs. Voss said, not unkindly, "you may take one. Which will it be?" And here is the thing she could not have known, and the reason her question landed on him the way a horse lands on a man's leg. In the fall of 1868, in a county in Missouri that has since changed its name, a fever went through and took a family named Rollins from the place next to the Loftons. Both parents, peacefully, within the same week, 3 children left standing in the yard. Wyatt's mother, Verlie Lofton, was a good woman with a hard year behind her and a thin larder in front of her. She walked over with a shawl on and she looked at those 3 children a long time, and then she said the sentence Wyatt has carried ever since. "We can take one." They took the girl, Selma, who was 8, because she could work. A family from the next township took the eldest, and the boy, Roland, who was 6, went with a wagon east toward Sedalia, with a man nobody in the county knew by name. Wyatt was 9. He stood on the top rail of the fence and watched that wagon until the dust of it was gone off the road, and Selma stood beside him and did not cry, which was worse than crying. He looked for Roland for 26 years. He wrote letters to counties. He asked at depots. He described a 6-year-old boy to men who had never in their lives met one. He learned to read better than a cowhand needs to read, for the single purpose of reading a clerk's list. He never found him. 26 years, and not one clerk in the world had a line of ink with that boy's name on it. So when a woman in a black bonnet asked him to pick one child out of 8 and leave the rest standing against a wall, Wyatt Lofton knew exactly what he was being handed. He had watched his own mother be handed it. She had done the best she could with it, and he had spent his whole life on the other side of that arithmetic, looking at a road. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll take all 8. The room got very quiet. Wilkie's head came up. Mrs. Voss did not laugh, which was to her credit, and she did not soften either. She turned her ledger around so he could see the printed rule at the head of the page. Children of the association were placed only into an established household, a man with a wife, a roof he held in his own name, and a year's provision laid by. "You are a single man," she said. "You have no house. By the record, you have no address but a ranch that belongs to another man. I am not permitted, and I would not be willing. Then I'll get a house. The car goes east on the 2nd of April, she said. What is not placed here goes on to Guthrie, and after that to the home at Fort Smith. I am sorry. 10 days is not a household." "No, ma'am," Wyatt said. "But it's 10 days. Tacy, 12 years old, said one word from the wall. "Sir?" And he did not trust himself to answer it, so he put his hat on and went out. What he did in the next 10 days is why men in that country still know his name. He had $612. It was 11 years of wages saved by a man who did not drink and did not gamble and had nothing in the world to spend it on. And it was meant, in some vague way he had never let himself say out loud, for a little outfit of his own someday, 40 head and a creek. The old Wembley place stood empty at the north end of the street, a 2-story boarding house with 11 rooms, built in the boom and shuttered since '85, when Orville Wembley died peacefully in his bed at 71. It had a cracked chimney, a sagging gallery, and a bank in Guthrie that wanted $750 for it and was tired of asking. Wyatt was short $138. So on the 4th morning he walked down to the livery and sold his horse. You have to understand what that is. A trail hand's saddle is not a thing he owns. It is the thing he A man could lose his hat, his coat, his name, and still be somebody in that country. A man on foot is nobody. Wyatt Lofton sold a 9-year-old sorrel gelding that knew his voice, and a saddle he had built up over 11 years, and he did it early in the morning when the street was empty so nobody would ask him why. The liveryman, a talker named Fentress, asked him anyway. "Buying a house," Wyatt said. "A man on foot can't work cattle." "No," Wyatt agreed. "He can't." And he walked up the street carrying his bedroll on his shoulder, $140 in his coat, and no way on earth to earn another cent at the only trade he had. He was not a fool about it. He had counted it out 3 nights running by lamplight in the bunkhouse on the back of a feed bill, the way he had once counted the counties he had written to. A horse would carry him 20 more years of other men's cattle and leave him at 60 with a saddle and a war bag. A roof would not carry him anywhere at all, but a roof could hold 8. That was the whole of his reasoning, and he never afterward described it any better than that, though he was asked to plenty of times. He paid the bank, he got the deed, and on the 9th of March, standing alone in the dust and the cold of the front room of a boarding house that smelled like 8 years of nobody, he opened the guest register that was still lying on the desk where Orville Wembley had left it, turned to a clean page, and wrote 8 names: Wilkie, Tacy, Hosea, Neva, Aussie, Cleta, Loyal, Meta. He did not have a single one of them yet. He did not have a wife either, and that rule had not moved. The next part he could not do alone, and the town did it for him, which surprised him more than anything in the whole business. Mrs. Sudie Rourke, 62, widowed twice, who had cooked for a section crew for 19 years and had opinions about everything, including the weather, walked into that boarding house on the 10th of March with a broom, looked at the ceiling, and said the flu would kill them all by Christmas if somebody didn't see to it. She stayed, not as a wife. She made that plain to anyone who raised an eyebrow, and Wyatt made it plainer. As housekeeper and cook, wages to be paid when there were wages, and a room of her own at the head of the stairs. Then it was 6 women from the Cimarron farms with bedding. Then it was Delaney Crisp, 60, who owned the Bar M and had lost a good hand and knew it, sending down a wagon of cut wood and 2 milk cows, and a note that said only, "Against future work." Then it was the schoolmaster, a quiet man of 33, named Linus Ware, who came in the evenings and mended the window sashes, and did not talk much about himself. None of them said much about why. That country had a way of doing a thing, and then talking about the weather. But there was hardly a family on the Cimarron that had not, at some point, been one bad winter from standing in a yard themselves, and everybody in Meridian Flat could do that arithmetic without being taught it. 11 days is what it took, in the end, because Mrs. Voss gave him one more than she had promised. And on the 2nd of April, with the eastbound car sitting at the Meridian Flat depot getting up steam, Harriet Voss walked the length of that boarding house with her ledger under her arm and would not sign. She had her reasons, and they were not cruelty, and this is where the story turns. In 1871, in Illinois, Harriet Voss had bent her own rule exactly once. She had placed a boy of 8, a quiet, undersized boy, with a bachelor farmer against the advice of her own board, because the man had a kind face, and the boy had held on to his coat. She had written to that placement every year, the way the association required. For 2 years, the letters came back answered. In the 3rd year, they came back marked unknown, and every letter after that came back the same way, for 11 years, until she stopped sending them. She had believed, for 23 years, that she had handed a child to a man who had gotten tired of him and turned him loose. She had written the household rule that hung at the top of her ledger page. She had enforced it in 4 states and never once bent it again, and she had never told a living soul why. She stood in the front room of the Wembley place on the 2nd of April and she said, "I cannot," and her voice was not steady. It was Linus Ware who spoke. He had come in with a box of chalk for the room they were making into a schoolroom, and he set it down, and he said, "Ma'am, you sent me west in 1871. She turned around. "Orville Wembley," he said. "This house. You wrote me every year, and I answered every year, and then he sent me east to the academy at Quincy so I could be schooled proper, and your letters came here, and I was not here. I wrote you from Quincy 4 times. I never had an answer, and I thought that was the way of it, and I was a boy, and I let it go." He took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his sleeve, because he had to do something with his hands. "He raised me 11 years, Linus said. He was a single man in a house too big for him. He died easy, right upstairs, and I sat with him. Ma'am, I have been in this town 9 years. I have your name in the front of the Bible he gave me. I did not know it was you until Wilkie there told me who was signing the papers." Harriet Voss put her hand on the desk, and then she asked the question that had been under the last 23 years of her life, and Linus Ware answered it. No, he had never once been turned loose. Not for a day. There was a man from the Guthrie paper on the street that week who had gotten wind of the 8 children and wanted the rest of it. The rule, the woman, the 23 years, all of it. It would have made a fine column. It would have made her the villain of it, printed in 4 counties. Wyatt Lofton walked him to the edge of town and said there wasn't a story, and that the woman had done 26 years of hard work that nobody would do for her, and that if he wanted to write about somebody, he could write about Mrs. Sudie Rourke and the flu. The paper ran nothing. Harriet Voss never knew until 1907, when Tacy told her. What Harriet Voss did know, on the 2nd of April, 1894, was what she saw when she turned back around. A man with no horse, in a house he had bought with everything he had, and 8 children who had put themselves in a line along the wall out of pure habit, and Wyatt Lofton going down the line and moving each one of them out of it, by the shoulder, one at a time, until they were just standing in a room like children in a house. She sat down at the desk. She opened the ledger. She wrote out 8 indentures of placement in a hand that shook on the first 2, and she signed her name 8 times. Then she took her pen and drew a line through the printed rule at the head of the page, and above it she wrote in the margin, "Brothers and sisters shall not be divided." It went to her board in June. They fought her for 2 years. It passed in 1896, and it stood for 30 years after that, and it is the reason a great many families in that country stayed whole, who otherwise would not have. Wyatt Lofton never got his 40 head and his creek. He got 11 rooms, a cracked chimney, and a boarding house that fed section crews and drummers and freighters for 29 years, and he worked it on foot until Wilkie was old enough to buy him a horse, which Wilkie did at 19, out of his own first wages, and which Wyatt rode exactly once a week thereafter, and no more. Hosea started talking in August of that first year, and once he started, he did not stop. Neva taught school in 3 counties. Ossie ran the freight line. Cleta married a doctor in Kingfisher. Loyal took over the house. Tacy kept the books for the whole family, and married nobody, and used to say that 8 was plenty. And in the spring of 1899, a letter came from Cincinnati. Harriet Voss, retired by then, had spent 5 years going backward through the association's records on her own time. Depot lists, receiving home books, 100 counties. She had found a man of 37 working a livery in Sedalia, Missouri, who had been placed out of a wagon in 1868 at the age of 6, and whose name on the receiving book was Roland. He came out in June. Wyatt met the train at Meridian Flat, and they stood on the platform a while, 2 grown men who had last seen each other from the top rail of a fence, and neither one of them managed much. Roland stayed 11 years. He is buried at the north end of the town cemetery, and Selma is buried beside him, and Harriet Voss, who died peacefully at 74 in 1910, is buried 9 rows over, at her own written request. The guest register of the Wembley House is in a case at the County Museum now, open to the page dated the 9th of March, 1894. The page where a man with no house and no wife and no earthly right to do it wrote down 8 names before he had a single one of them. Somebody, years later, added a 9th in a different hand. Roland, and under all 9, in Tacy's careful bookkeeper's script, 1 line. Nobody chose one.